Conclusion. Ultimately, low birth rates are a cultural and ethical problem, a sign of a worldwide spiritual crisis. Having children is simply not viewed as a fulfilling life project anymore by many couples. Only when young men and women turn away from consumerism and individualism will birth rates begin to climb beyond replacement levels. Michael Cook, clutching at straws to reverse the birth dearth. A decade before I became a dad, an episode of Dennis Prager's talk show left a lasting impression on me. Marrying well was the theme of the day. To expose singles' mixed-up priorities, Prager read a random personal ad that mentioned an interest in backpacking. Then he pounced. I quote from memory, "If you ever have kids, you're not going to have any time left for backpacking." The largely middle-aged audience, most of them parents, I'm sure, roared with laughter and approval. But this is no laughing matter. When we think about parenthood, we don't picture our children's smiling faces or a game of family dodgeball. Instead, we picture life devoid of relaxation or independence. I doubt Prager meant that kids were a bad deal overall, but it sure sounded that way. You're having kids? Then no more backpacking for you. No more doing anything you like. I don't deny that some parents immiserate themselves for their children's sake. What I reject is the widely shared assumption that conflict between kids and happiness is unavoidable. It's natural for anti-natalists to equate the first couple of kids with servitude, and any more with slavery. What amazes me is how readily natalists agree. You'd expect them to downplay parental misery. Instead, most race to concede its inevitability, and tell us to be less calculating and selfish. At least to my ears, natalists' pleas against prudence are pretty lame. Arguing against foresight with a straight face isn't easy. Imagine the public service campaign. You think too much. Just have a baby. Appeals to duty are less laughable. Your parents sacrificed their happiness to have you, now it's your turn. But aspiring grandparents have tried guilt since the dawn of man. It's hard to imagine that strangers nagging will succeed where relatives nagging failed. The child-free don't want to sacrifice their lifestyles, and parents feel like they've already sacrificed enough. This book takes a different approach. I don't defend acting on impulse. I'm a big fan of planning ahead. I don't preach a duty to be fruitful and multiply. I expect sermons to fall on deaf ears. Instead, I appeal to enlightened self-interest. While kids can make their parents unhappy, the choice between kids and happiness is largely self-imposed. My goal isn't to attack consumerism and individualism, but to join forces with them, to show that kids are a better deal than they seem. Today's typical parents aren't miserable, but they've turned parenting into a chore and act as if happier paths are impossible or abusive. They're mistaken. Kids are not like tropical fish that only flourish in a carefully controlled environment. Twin and adoption studies find that the long-run effects of parenting are shockingly small. As long as you don't do anything crazy, your kids will probably turn out fine. Contrary to Dennis Prager, you can be a great parent and an avid backpacker. Rather than trying to raise the perfect child, you should enjoy the journey together. Maybe your kid will turn out to be a backpacker just like you. If I convince you of nothing more, I'll be happy. But since I never burned my bridges to consumerism and individualism, I can cross them to reach my conclusion. As a consumer, how do you change your behavior when a product gets cheaper or better or easier to purchase? You buy more, you go back, you tell your friends, you post a 5-star review on Amazon. If kids are the product, consumer logic still applies. Buy more as the deal gets sweeter. When you make parenting less work and more fun, consumerism and individualism become reasons to have more kids, not to stop before you start. Books on to be or not to be a parent rarely have a bottom line. They list pluses and minuses but refuse to give readers a straight answer. Selfish Reasons to Have More Kids, in contrast, bears a straight answer on its cover. This raises an awkward question for me. Wouldn't an agnostic approach show a lot more respect for individual choice than telling people what to do? Not really. Way back in the introduction, I explicitly limited my advice to people who are at least mildly interested in being a parent. What do I say to people who don't like children? Nothing. Traditional natalism, with its strong sense that everyone should bear children for the common good, is pushy. I'm not. If you know the real trade-offs yet prefer a life of speed dating and exotic travel, it's not my place to pester you. Once you buy into the idea of kids, however, I can give definite advice and respect your choices at the same time. I don't claim that you should have any specific number of children. That depends on your priorities. I'm an overgrown kid at heart, so it's no wonder that fatherhood agrees with me. Tonight, I'm taking my kids to meet the author of the Scooby-Doo chapter books. How cool is that? If you'd rather taste wine at an art gallery, I can see why you'd want fewer kids than I do. Still, whatever your priorities happen to be, my arguments are reasons to have more kids than you initially planned. Most ideas don't have consequences. These do. The depressing thing about exciting ideas is that most of them go nowhere. To see your ideas in action, you often have to convince millions of your fellow citizens that they're worth trying. In practice, that's almost impossible. My other book, The Myth of the Rational Voter: Why Democracies Choose Bad Policies, spotlights clever reforms that the man in the street will probably never consider. Almost everyone who's pondered a free market in human kidneys admits that it's a great way to make sick people healthy and poor people rich, but no politician who values his career would try to sell this policy to the American public. If selfish reasons to have more kids convinces you, however, you don't have to convert millions of your fellow citizens to act. If you can persuade one person, your partner, the two of you can go full steam ahead. Other parents may disapprove, but forget about them. They're too exhausted by their own parenting to pay much attention to yours. If you can't fully persuade your spouse, welcome to the club. Although my wife and I have 3 children together, she still thinks I'm a little crazy. That's okay. If I expected to convert her to my way of thinking, I would be crazy. I count myself lucky to have persuaded my wife to try some of my ideas. We rarely enroll our kids in activities they don't enjoy. We barely monitor the content of their video games. We had a 3rd child, and finally started ignoring his 2 a.m. tantrums. If my wife thinks that any of these are her ideas, even better. A Tale of 2 Sonograms. I'll never forget my wife's first sonogram. The technician stared at the monitor while she asked my wife boilerplate questions about her medical history. How long have you been pregnant? About 12 weeks. Morning sickness? A little. Any family history of genetic diseases? No. Any history of twins? No. Well, you're having twins. My eyes bugged out. I was pretty sure a twin hoax would be a firing offense, but I still stammered, "You wouldn't joke about something like that?" When the tech showed me the screen, my eyes bugged out a little more. There they were, 2 tiny bodies with massive heads. As I drove back to work, I was pale white. 2 kids. What were we going to do? 7 years later, my wife was pregnant again. This time, I hoped for twins. I proposed baby names in pairs. The thought of triplets didn't faze me. Before the sonogram technician turned on the machine, I asked for an ASAP answer to our burning question. Are there more multiples in our future? 5 minutes later, we had our answer. No. We were going to be a family of 5, not 6 or 7. I was delighted to have another healthy child on the way, but couldn't help but feel slightly disappointed. Why was I so afraid of twins the first time around, and so hopeful the next? What did I learn between the 2 pregnancies? In part, I gained self-knowledge. I expected to like playing with my kids, but I didn't realize that taking care of them would be so satisfying. When the twins outgrew their 2 a.m. feeding, I kind of missed it. Yet most of what I figured out between the sonograms was not about my personality, but about the link between science and life. Before I became a dad, the conflict between my book learning and modern parenting was purely academic. After I became a dad, the conflict suddenly became very practical. Belief in the power of nurture inspired other parents to make painful sacrifices for their children and dread the thought of another baby. Wouldn't it stand to reason, then, that my disbelief in the power of nurture ought to inspire me to avoid painful sacrifices for my children and welcome the thought of another baby? Although parents rarely had solid answers to my questions, It seemed rash to dismiss their first-hand experience. Maybe parents saw crucial facts that researchers missed. By the time our twins were toddlers, however, I realized that I didn't need to discount anyone's experiences. Parents heavily influence their kids in many ways. They see it with their own eyes. Their mistake is to assume that their influence lasts a lifetime instead of fading out as their kids grow up. Once I reconciled my book learning with my first-hand experience, I had a lot to reconsider, starting with our first fateful sonogram. My knee-jerk reaction was dead wrong. I should have been thrilled to get 2 kids for the price of 1, while my wife and I could have made ourselves miserable by mindlessly doubling all the standard parental sacrifices. We compromised on a more relaxed approach. We spent money to make our lives easier. We didn't struggle to put our twins in the best preschool or Pee-wee chess championship. We let them watch TV. Twins were a little tiring at first, but I kept my 2 a.m. double feedings in perspective. The extra startup costs were modest, and these kids would be ours for the rest of our lives. That's why I went to our second big sonogram hoping for twins. Would 4 kids ruin our lives? That was up to us. How would we handle another set of twins? The same way we handled the first set. Work a little harder for a year or so, and remember that parenting is graded pass-fail. When the sonogram showed a healthy singleton, I had to fight the temptation to tell my wife, "Better luck next time." I counted my blessings but never felt relieved. I can tell you what I learned between those 2 sonograms while standing on 1 foot. There's no substitute for reasonable expectations. If you imagine that your children's future is in your hands and single-mindedly do whatever is best for your kids, then 1 child is more than enough to ruin your life. But once you accept that your children's future is largely up to them and remember that your happiness counts too, an unplanned set of twins is no big deal. Before long, you'll probably think they're the best thing that ever happened to you. I know we did.